Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Oh, thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Let's see if we can get this thing to load up, huh? All right. Well, I'm here today to share Wild Fish Conservancy's work evaluating an experimental salmon trap for stock-selective commercial harvest in the lower Columbia River. And with this project, we're striving to reduce bycatch and hatchery impacts in commercial salmon fisheries. Ultimately, we feel this is for the benefit of, well, not just wild fish, but for fishermen and coastal fishing communities. Just to provide a little background to the story, the Columbia River, a lot like the Fraser, was once one of the most productive salmon rivers on the West Coast. And of course, everything changed with the arrival of Europeans to the region. There was essentially no regulation of these fisheries and dramatic overharvest of these stocks. And in just a matter of decades, these once incredible runs on the Columbia River system were decimated. And in combination with the effects of habitat loss, construction of dams, hatcheries, and ocean conditions, we now have less than 1/10 of the historical abundance of these once incredible runs in the Columbia River system. And that's inflicted some pretty severe consequences to these coastal fishing communities, tribal and commercial. But despite the decline of the resource, fishermen year after year continue to want to get out on the river to do what they've been doing for generations. And they're doing so with the one gear that's legal and available to them on the Columbia River system, and that's the conventional gill net. So that brings us to the challenge, and it's a pretty immense challenge. We're using conventional gill nets in this mixed stock fishery, and as we've heard, gill nets can't really release wild salmonid bycatch unharmed very well. So this impedes wild salmonid recovery, and beyond that, it also impedes commercial fishing opportunities as well. Of course, mortality to threatened or endangered salmonids ends up constraining fisheries just solely out of management concerns. And so the situation is bad for fish, and it's bad for fishermen. And there's clearly a big need for change and for selective harvest in terminal, in-river locations if we're ever going to find a way forward for wild fish and fishermen. So we were very pleased to see that one commercial fisherman in the lower Columbia system, Blair Peterson, based out of Cathlamet, Washington, he had this idea to try something completely outside the box. He wanted to try Washington State's first commercial fish trap as a selective harvest and also a ecological monitoring tool in the lower Columbia River. And we really thought he was onto something. And he had this really deep personal connection to the gear. First of all, he's just a historian. He's a true character and a great man. But his grandfather was a trap fisherman in the lower Columbia. You could see the old pilings as you head upriver. And also his father fished traps as a teenager in the Columbia River. So Blair has this very deep connection to the gear, and we really thought he was on to something to use this tool for selective harvest. Now, of course, fish traps have been used by many, many cultures around the world for thousands of years. First Nations, tribes around this area used fish traps to harvest salmon for thousands of years, and they did so sustainably. And of course, everything changed once Europeans adopted the technology, and fish traps weren't used for sustainable harvests or stock selective harvests like we're trying to use them now. They were used with the intent of harvesting everything that they could encounter and as efficiently as possible. And these fish traps were a destructive force in the past. So from the 1880s through the 1950s, from Oregon all the way up through Alaska, these fish traps were everywhere, and they were part of the problem. And a major part of the problem back then was a complete lack of regulation. I mean, there was just too much fishing effort everywhere, as we know. But traps were definitely a big part of the problem. And beyond that, a lot of political pressure mounted from the gill netting communities, which perceived the traps as a means for these massive salmon canning corporations to, in a sense, monopolize the fishery and reduce labor costs. And so from the 1930s through the 1950s, fish traps were banned. And now it's kind of interesting today. These fish traps that were once banned because they were part of the problem might actually provide the path forward for fish and fishermen. Fish traps are a form of fixed gear. They involve very little entanglement, ideally no entanglement. And you could modify this gear to reduce air exposure and handling and overcrowding. And like our previous speaker was talking about, that's what it's all about. So we thought this gear had a lot of potential. We really thought Blair Peterson from Kathlama, Washington was onto something, and we teamed up with him in 2016 to try to test out the first trap in Washington state waters in over 80 years. So in actually 2016, we rounded up funding to try it out for the first time. And in 2017, we set out to assess post-release survival from the gear. And our objectives were very simple and straightforward. See if we could build a trap that was effective at capturing salmon, and then estimate post-release survival of fall chinook and steelhead. We also encountered coho in this fishery, but just due to the migratory nature of the species, which doesn't tend to move beyond Bonneville Dam in large numbers, we didn't actually assess survival of coho, just fall chinook and steelhead. And so in order to achieve our objectives, we went back to these old records, which was a pretty amazing trip through history. We dug through just boxes and boxes of these old records. And all of the trap blueprints differed dramatically based upon where they were placed, within a river, within an estuary, a small tributary. And so we dug through boxes and boxes of these records to try to find the best design for the Lower Columbia River system. Unfortunately, as you could see from this design here, there isn't a ton of detail. And so it required a lot of careful engineering. We ended up settling on this basic lead heart spiller design for the Lower Columbia River. From this diagram, you could get a better idea how fish traps work. Fish generally moving upstream hit this long lead of pilings that's perpendicular to shore. And there's so nets that extend from the high water mark down to the river or estuary bottom. And it's a small mesh so you can't entangle fish. The fish try to find their way around this lead, and in the process, get lost in this compartment called the heart. And due to the shape of that compartment, fish have a hard time finding their way back out. And eventually, they're guided by their natural drive to move upstream through what we call the tunnel and into the spiller, which is this final compartment where the fish, for the most part, are completely entrapped. And so once the fish move through this tunnel, which has a very wide entrance and a narrow outlet, they just have a hard time finding their way out of this spiller compartment. And operators of the gear, who are standing adjacent to the spiller compartment on a dock on the side here, you could see just visually how many fish are moving through here. And usually what you see is generally what you have. And of course that depends on water clarity, so it can be a little bit tricky. But the goal here is to avoid overcrowding. And that's one benefit of the gear. You can watch your spiller compartment and make sure that you're not having too many fish in that spiller where you could have some problems. So when that spiller's reached its capacity, so generally around 30 fish or so, I mean, the spiller itself, it's about, let's see, it's 18 by 18. So there's plenty of water in that spiller, and holding 30 fish is no problem. But the live well itself, where sorting occurs, you don't want more than about 30 fish in that live well. So once you get about 30 fish, you close this tunnel by pulling it to the side, and then you're able to lift the bottom mesh of the spiller upwards in the water column with this solar-powered winch that we have here. So you guide the bottom of the spiller upwards in the water column with line and pulley and this winch. You get the fish into the shallows, and this all happens very rapidly. It takes about a minute. You guide these fish out with line and pulley, ideally keeping them submerged at all times. And then you guide them out of the spiller compartment and into a live well, where an individual stands and you could sort through your catch. So in a commercial setting, what you'd do is you would select out, for example, in the lower Columbia, your hatchery, Chinook, and coho. You would then bleed those fish, put them on ice, and the wild fish you just leave in that live well until you're finished with the set, and just open up a door and they swim out. The whole goal is to minimize handling, air exposure, net contact, all of the above. But as you're sorting, you have your crew drop the spiller compartment down again, and you're fishing again with only 2 minutes that have gone by where you haven't been fishing. So it's incredibly rapid. You lift that spiller compartment up, spill the fish out, immediately drop that spiller back down. Takes a total of about 2 minutes, and then you're sorting through the fish while you're actively fishing that the next set. So it's pretty slick. But of course, in 2017, we weren't harvesting any of the fish. We were just tagging pretty much every adult Chinook and steelhead that we could get our hands on. So we tagged day and night. And then we would release these fish that had undergone this treatment procedure, this commercial procedure. And we'd track the fish as they passed the various dams located upstream. So of course the dams are awful for fish recovery, but for mark recapture studies, they're fairly helpful. So we tracked our treatment group of fish that had undergone this commercial capture procedure and had been pit tagged, and we compared the detection rate of that treatment group to a control group, those that haven't undergone this commercial capture procedure but have been pit tagged. So you're controlling for the handling and tagging effect there. And then you'd compare these detection rates at Bonneville Dam, the Dalles Dam, and McNary Dam. And so assessing survival over a 400-kilometer distance, about a couple weeks for these fish. And this was mirroring strategies of Washington State that had assessed other gear types like beach seines and purse seines and gill nets. And we chose this methodology to have the best possible apples-to-apples comparison for our studies. So like I said, this is a paired mark release recapture design, control and treatment, so relative survival. We use the Cormac Jolly Sieber method, which is a great method for controlling for the effects of handling and tagging, also for separating the effects of detection from survival. And then I estimated survival in the profile likelihood 95% confidence interval through a program called USER, and model selection was performed through the log likelihood ratio test. And we were thrilled in 2017. We captured over 7,100 salmonids that year in about 30 days of fishing, working very long hours. We had a really tough crew, and I'm really thankful for that. We pit tagged over 2,000 Chinook and nearly 800 steelhead. The majority of our catch was coho salmon, followed by Chinook salmon and steelhead in that year. And then when we estimated survival in the various reaches, here were our results. Once again, this is relative survival, treatment to control. Survival over this 400, over this 400-kilometer migration was 99.5%, which was very impressive relative to the results that Washington Fish and Wildlife had estimated for gill nets and tangle nets and beach seines and purse seines. And for steelhead, survival over this 400-kilometer migration was 94.4%. So another excellent result. And actually in the Columbia River system, when they looked at steelhead survival for beach seines and purse seines, survival was also very excellent for steelhead in the Columbia system. Comparing these results to that of the gill net and the tangle net here, the fish trap appears to be an excellent selective harvest tool. As you can see here, the gill net, about 52% survival. That's the accepted rate for gill nets in the Columbia system. 99.5 for the fish trap. For steelhead, 55.2% for the gill net, relative to 94.4%. So based upon those results, it was clear to us that the prototype design was efficient at capturing fish, which is what you'd expect based upon history. Traps were incredibly efficient in the past. And beyond that, post-release survival was excellent relative to these other gear types, assessed through the same method. So we believe that application of the tool was warranted for stock-selective harvest and also for research and monitoring purposes. And we were very pleased to see that the state of Washington agreed, based on these results, to implement the first selective trap fishery in the Columbia River in Washington in over 80 years. So this was a pretty amazing project to take part in, to see these fish brought to market for the first time in decades with this method. So it was interesting to see how the trap would perform in a commercial setting, what that trap fishery would look like, and also to get an idea of product quality. Because we had seen this in action before, and I mean, these fish, there isn't a scale off of them, there's no bruising. It's really a pretty slick process. And we thought, potentially in the future that could add some value to the product for fishermen. And all the fishermen involved, the processors involved, the buyers involved, all thought that the product was of a quality that they hadn't seen before in other fisheries. These hatchery fish would be selectively harvested from the live well, placed in that soft dip net, delivered to Blair Peterson here. He'd live bleed them. We then put them in slush ice immediately. This is a big collaborative project, so Washington State was out there with us, sampling alongside Wild Fish Conservancy staff. These fish would then be transferred about a mile away, just across the channel, really, to Puget Island to be processed at C&H Classic Smoked Fish. So it really was a neat process and very informative. I think product quality was kind of the highlight of 2018. There's definitely a lot of potential for added value in the future. Unfortunately, since there isn't a reputation, there hadn't been a reputation established in the marketplace for this fish trap caught product, we couldn't secure any added value in that year. We were just accepting the gill net market price. But in the future, I'm really looking forward to seeing the added value and the potential of that for fishermen. So in 2018, for that test fishery, we harvested 1,097 hatchery adult Chinook and coho, no adult immediate mortalities. All of the wild adult Chinook were released, and that represented 60% of our total adult Chinook catch. So in the conventional gill net fishery on the Columbia River, since the mortality estimates for gill nets are so bad, the state actually allows the harvest of those wild fish that might be listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. Also, wild coho, 49% of our catch was wild, and that was successfully released. And once again, in that conventional fishery, those fish are harvested and sold, but they could be actually threatened under the ESA. And of course, all of our steelhead were successfully released. And applying the release survival rates to this, to our catch in 2018 is estimated, about 21 wild salmonid mortalities occurred from that fishery. And this is in contrast with this non-selective conventional gill net fishery, where you have, around 4,500 wild salmon mortalities over this 4-day fishing period. And this is all, the 2018 mortality estimates here are it's just coarse calculations, but it gives you a rough idea of the benefits of selective harvest. And, I kept wondering, what would this trap fishery look like had we scaled it up? And once again, this is very coarse as well. But scaling up, say you had 12 similarly performing traps in the Columbia River system in 2018. Basically, you could generate an equivalent amount of revenue to that conventional gillnet fishery with about a 95-96% reduction in wild salmon mortality. So pretty impressive results. And then looking at the revenue end, 2018 was unfortunately a very, very poor year for Columbia River fall Chinook and coho. Only about $25,000 in terms of revenue were generated, accepting the gillnet market price in 2018 from that test fishery. But a lot of the processors, the buyer, the fishermen involved, all believe that you could generate substantial added value in the future once you've established a reputation for this product in the marketplace, you have sustainable market certification, you're using all best harvest practices, live bleeding, icing on site. But they firmly believe that you could secure troll market prices from this in the future. And say you did, you basically double your revenue in a given year. And this is in contrast to the mean gillnetter on the Columbia River, which generated a little over $4,000 from fishing that year in 2018. So once again, if you scaled up this fishery, say you had 12 traps operating in the lower Columbia River, just accepting the 2018 gillnet market price, you could generate an equivalent amount of revenue to that conventional gillnet fishery. And if you secured any added value on top, of course you would exceed the conventional fishery there. And if you secured that troll market price, like I had mentioned, eventually, you could basically double revenue from the conventional gillnet fishery. So conclusions from 2018, despite this very poor salmon return, the trap still generated significant revenue, accepting the gillnet market price. We know there's substantial potential for added value to trap caught products. Fish harvested from a trapper in fantastic quality, and also very minimal estimated mortality to ESA-listed stocks. So in the future, trap fishers could maybe fish for longer, harvest more fish sustainably, and generate more revenue. And once again, all of this is based off, so we estimated mortality in 2017, and the results were great. But moving forward, we've also identified a whole bunch of changes to the design of traps. For example, currently we're using a winch to lift these fish up into the shallows. And we've identified a new strategy where we have essentially a tunnel that leads from your spiller compartment directly to your live well. So there's zero handling, zero air exposure, and no entanglement. And I really think that's the solution. At that point, these fish would have undergone very, very little stress. So that's what we're hoping to put to the test this year. And we're looking forward to that. And the benefits, at this point, I mean, everybody's pretty much on the same page when it comes to selective harvest. But one thing that isn't quite as obvious is in the future, I think these traps could serve a dual purpose for research and monitoring and selective harvest simultaneously. You have this great opportunity, if you wanted to get your hands on fish, to gather coded wire tags, pit tags. You could estimate run timing, survival. For example, in the lower river, far below Bonneville Dam, or here in the Fraser River. There are many opportunities to apply traps just for research and monitoring purposes. And in addition, this live capture selective harvest method could really help reduce bycatch mortality, of course, which ideally would improve escapement for our wild stocks, depending on allocation, of course. And also, traps can be a more efficient tool for removing hatchery fish, which, of course, in the Columbia system is such a major problem. So ideally, removing more of these hatchery fish, we could hopefully improve the fitness of our wild populations, which are impacted so heavily by these hatchery populations that return and escape the fishery. And hopefully we could help reduce the ecological competition that results from escapement of these hatchery fish. And also with a trap, you could better maintain age and size structure of your fish populations. Of course, we know that gill nets over time result in a smaller and smaller salmon over time, just because you're selecting for a certain size and age of fish. And then hopefully this would provide benefits for coastal fishing communities. With a lower impact to these threatened stocks, fishermen could hopefully fish for longer and in a sustainable manner. And hopefully they could secure a higher price point per pound, just solely from higher product quality, from harvesting fish with a trap in such a clean manner with no bruising or scale loss. And also through use of value-added practices, that's really important for fetching a higher price. I firmly believe that traps could be certified sustainable in the marketplace. And there's tons of branding, marketing opportunities for something like a trap. So hopefully this would help provide a way forward for these struggling fishing communities in the Columbia River that basically have no opportunity or very little opportunity anymore. And hopefully by shifting our fisheries out of the ocean, out of Puget Sound, and in river with selective harvest tools, we could help the ecosystem. And also orca whales by preserving their marine prey, helping with the long-term recovery of marine prey, and increasing the quality of marine prey by protecting age and size structure of Chinook salmon populations. So that's pretty much all I have to say. Of course, we couldn't have done this without our funders, NOAA Fisheries, Washington Fish and Wildlife, Oregon Fish and Wildlife. And I believe we have a short film that we might queue up here. I initially thought I had about 25 minutes, but it turns out I had 45 minutes in the end. But we'll show a film, and that should help give you a better idea of how a trap fishery works.
Since 2016, we've been researching fish traps and other commercial harvest techniques that can passively and selectively target hatchery fish and other healthy stocks of fish while releasing all wild, potentially threatened and endangered fish completely unharmed.
It's a big community revitalization project with local fishermen involved, local processors, state of Washington, and Wild Fish Conservancy. We've been researching this for the last couple of years, investigating bycatch survival and the ability of this gear to selectively harvest hatchery fish and other healthy stocks. And now we've finally been given the green light by the state of Washington to operate this commercially. It's a massive step forward.
In the open ocean, when you're bringing fish to hand, you don't know if those fish are from California, if those are BC fish or Alaska fish. There's no way to be certain which runs you're targeting, and it could be a weak endangered run or it could be a strong healthy run. But in an open ocean setting, you can't differentiate. When you're in a terminal fishery, like this fishery in the Columbia River, you know you're fishing Columbia River stocks, so you can manage for those stocks. You can limit your catch or increase your catch based off of the health of that population.
I gill netted for a long time, and that is an enjoyable fishery, but I've accepted the fact in today's era, as far as federal and state regulations and endangered species and threatened species, that the ways of yesteryear and old are not acceptable right now. And this Columbia River has to have salmon, and these small towns have to have a commercial fishery. And right now, this is proving itself that this is capable as far as up and down this river, as far as these traps.
Our results so far have been really promising. For example, over 99% of wild Chinook salmon released from a trap survived to head back to the spawning grounds. In contrast, wild Chinook survival from a gill net is only 52%. Since survival is so poor, management currently allows the harvest and sale of all wild Chinook that potentially might be threatened or endangered. Transitioning to alternative fishing gears such as fish traps, we can dramatically increase the number of wild salmon returning to our rivers and streams. Got a hatchery, coho, adult.
Well, just first of all, the freshness. This comes out of the water, and within 20 seconds, 30 seconds, he's bled and iced. I butchered a lot of fish in Alaska, and like I said, these are by far the best fish I've ever done.
I moved most of the fish that was harvested this summer, and response has been fantastic.
Just having the story of this product, I think people are going to really connect to that. If you have a Portland consumer that's looking at a beautiful fish that was pulled out of the Columbia River, using a gear type that's going to help rebuild a resource, of course somebody is going to want to support that. And I think as a young fisherman, coming from the aspect of wanting to maintain this fishery so that I can do it when I'm old, so that my kids could do it.
In theory, you could pluck it from the trap and get it to the processor within half an hour if you really wanted to. It's just across the river.
From the minute it's harvested till the minute it's processed, it's in slush ice.
I bought my first fish off the Columbia River 40 years ago, both kings and sockeye in those days. And in 45 years of being in the industry, I've never seen a better way to catch fish for quality and just gentleness on the fish and sustainability.
You think this is the wave of the future?
I do. I think it is. It was a wave of the past, and it worked then, and there's no reason it shouldn't work now. I do think that this is what it'll have to be on the river.
It is one of those that's good for fishermen, it's good for fish, and it's good for coastal communities and coastal economies. It could be a major component in how we do recover all of this. And I mean from California to Alaska. What we're seeing in the Columbia can be reproduced other places, and I'm anxious to see that and the benefits from it.
Questions?
Hi, thanks very much. Excellent. The obvious question, how much does it cost to build that sucker? Because that's the biggest issue with a lot of these things is the cost of construction.
Right, and a big component of that is the cost of the untreated pilings. So just to clarify, all of the pilings are untreated. There's no creosote involved. But yeah, it absolutely depends on the cost of pilings, which depends on the region you're in. And so recently, the price for pilings in the Columbia has gone up. And so a cost of a trap with similar to this one, but with our most recent designs, would running around 120 grand.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I think Finn Donnelly was up.
Okay. Yeah.
Two questions then, Adrian. That's first of all, great, fantastic presentation. Second time I've seen it. The first question is, can you talk a little bit about the greenhouse gas comparisons? Are you looking at that compared to gillnet fishery, et cetera? And then number two, can you talk a little bit more about who you're working with in Canada? How far along you can tell us about moving into Canada?
Absolutely. So, yeah, one very positive thing about the gear relative to other gear types is that the carbon footprint is pretty low. Of course, you gotta drive the pilings, and that takes some work and effort with a pile driver. But once you get it installed, I mean, you're running the winch with it's all solar powered, and with our designs into the future where you don't even need a winch. I mean, you don't even need the solar power even for that. It's just the fish passively swim into your live well, and you could let the wild ones go free untouched. So yeah, I think overall the carbon footprint would be quite a bit lower relative to, say, a gillnet fishery or a seine fishery where you're running your diesel boat. That takes up a lot of carbon for sure. Let's see, and the second part of your question was...
Coming to Canada.
Oh gosh. Yeah, we're really excited to be working with the Steelhead Society of BC to test this out somewhere in the Fraser. So we're excited to do a site visit probably in April. We'll be trying to find the ideal spot, and we'll go from there. And there's a lot of planning to do and a lot of site-specific engineering. But yeah, we're really thrilled to have this opportunity and to work with the Steelhead Society of BC.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting thoughts up here, and again, I applaud what you've done. I think it's wonderful. I remember the old ISAB talking about something like this over a decade ago, so congratulations on doing it. I think one of the things up here is, what's the reception you're getting with the gillnet fleet in the lower Columbia versus we would have to talk to however many Fraser gillnetters remain, and that in terms of reception, because they're not all going to work, and so there has to be some way to change over the whole gear and license agreements.
Right, and change is always really tough, and it's been a tough sell from the start when we started trying to get this project going. But we've seen over the years a pretty dramatic shift in opinion, and especially when you bring fishermen on site to see it in action, because it really is pretty simple to operate, pretty easy to operate. You just lift up that winch, and then you're sorting through fish. It couldn't be much easier. Our fisherman Blair kind of takes pride in, in almost being lazy, and he said, "I'm the laziest fisherman there is," and he's proud of it, because it really is an easy setup for fishermen. And so when they see that in action and how efficient it is and how it might provide a future, opinion is changing, but it is a tough sell. And until there's talk in Washington State of banning gillnets, and until some sort of policy is in place to switch over, I think people will probably continue to push against any change. So it just kind of depends on the policies that are in place, and if there's a phase out that's scheduled, I think fishermen are suddenly going to be in favor of having an alternative rather than nothing at all.
Hey, Adrian, great presentation. Could you speak for a second in your design learning as you guys are imagining this going forward? I imagine during a high water year, those pylons could get pushed around or something like that. Or if you imagine this being used in a more volatile water system, Columbia's got dams that help control flow and things like that. Have you been thinking or daydreaming about what that would look like as a solution?
Yeah, so I think about this day and night and in my dreams. I have nightmares, absolutely. Yeah, and the Columbia River has a lot of dams, and it's much more controlled than other systems. And I know fish traps will continue to work very well in the Columbia River system. And so in the future, yeah, we got to consider what are the more protected locations. You know, are there ice flows moving down the river? Are there massive debris drifts? All of this has to be taken into account. But you look back at history, and these traps were everywhere, and they worked pretty well. So I imagine we're going to find a lot of different locations that'll work out. But yes, I do have those nightmares all the time. And yes, we got to design it, pick a site very carefully, and these traps will function completely differently depending on the site and the conditions and what fish are moving through the system. And there are a lot of things to take into account, and to make it sustainable, you got to do it right.
I'm just wondering, the numbers you presented, is it something you see as commercially viable, though? Because when you look at the cost of it and then the $25,000 you mentioned as the income, is that just a window of what you were looking at for a season, or is that an entire year? And is this like a mom and pop industry, or is it actually a commercial viability?
Right, so 2018 was a very, very poor salmon run. One of the worst in history for fall Chinook and coho, or not for coho, but for fall Chinook. So yeah, it was a very poor run, and we were just accepting the gillnet market price since nobody knew what a trap-caught salmon was and would be willing to pay a higher price for that at this point. And we don't have sustainable market certification yet. All of those things that differentiate the product to the consumer. So there's a lot of work to do there to secure that added value into the future. And also, you know, having a better run would definitely help. So hopefully, if you just about doubled your revenue from added value, value-added practices into the future, that's maybe. Also, we only fished for 20 days. That $25,000 was achieved over a 20-day period. So hopefully, into the future, you have a better run, you secure added value, and you can generate more revenue. Because yeah, it is a higher upfront cost than, say, a gill netter. But it's not that much different than your seine boat. So it's yeah, it depends on your run, right? It's fishing. Yeah.
I was really impressed with your almost 100% survival up the river. There's a lot of sea lions that are supposed to be predating on salmon just below Bonneville Dam. Any insight on why you got 100% survival into the ladders? Where is it?
So
just the timing?
That's a relative survival relative to a control group. So you're controlling for the effects of pit tagging the fish and handling this fish, because you got to mark the fish to estimate survival through this paired mark release recapture design. And then on top of that, yeah, there is predation by marine mammals, but we're assessing survival relative to a control group that hasn't undergone the commercial operation. So survival of those fish, yeah, with predation and everything, it's not your 99.5%. We've estimated, so based upon, and then other fish are moving up tributaries before they get to the dams and all of these other factors. But we've estimated with, accounting for marine mammal predation, disease, et cetera, fish moving up some tributaries, it's around about 72% survival up to Bonneville Dam. I'm taking into account marine mammal predation and tag loss and other factors.
So that's slightly different than what I thought you were doing in the study. So I get what the paired release study is, but what's the survival to Bonneville for the trap caught fish versus the non-trap caught fish then?
Right, so it's about 73 versus around 72%.
Okay.
Thanks, that was a great presentation. It's very exciting. This is a question on monitoring and compliance, I guess. And so presumably because this is a pilot and you guys are on board and there's a lot of focus on it, you're really adhering to best practices, and there's lots of monitoring happening. But if you're scaling this out, and suddenly there's more people doing this, how do how much monitoring do you think is required to make sure that all the best practices are being adhered to, so that you get the maximum benefit, maximum conservation benefit, or is that not an issue?
Oh, that's a huge issue, and hopefully as this moves forward from proof of concept to an expanded real commercial fishery, will help establish some regulations to make sure that people are operating traps right. And so, yeah, in the future, I think there should be electronic monitoring at every trap. In 2017, we had live streaming video of all of our sets, and it's so easy to do, and it's so cheap. And these days, you could have live streaming electronic monitoring of every trap. So say you had 12 traps in the Columbia River, you do electronic monitoring, and then on top of that, like I said, I really hope it serves a dual selective harvest and research purposes into the future. So you have these research stations in the Columbia River or the Fraser, and you have biologists on there collecting all the information that we all hope to collect throughout the fishery. So hopefully, you could randomly sample these traps, say 12 traps in the system, keep people on their toes, and yeah, I think monitoring is essential, and we got to come up with some good rules for that. Come again? That's right, and historically, you look back at some of these accounts, and management actually, in a lot of situations, loved these traps because they were easy to monitor, and they weren't necessarily in favor of them being banned. It's a lot harder to regulate and enforce things on a whole bunch of individual drift gillnet boats out there. Yeah, and that's the thing when it comes to science. You got to get out there and test your hypothesis. And until then, you don't know. And we're in a situation here where you better try something different. And so I think it's absolutely worth a shot and see if it works. And if it doesn't, you gave it your best shot, right?
Very much, Adrian. We will have an opportunity to ask everybody some questions towards the end of the afternoon, so you will have another crack at it. I'd like to thank Adrian very much for his presentation.